The Spangled Unicorn was hazy, smelling of cheap beer and regret. Basil Bagel Baker, a man who knew both well, sat at the sticky counter. He stared at his reflection in the half-empty shot glass. His reflection stared back, a mirror of a man teetering on the edge of a bad decision. Beside him, Trixie, a woman whose eyelashes could double as feather dusters, giggled. Her laughter was the soundtrack to Basil's impending doom.
Come on, Basil, baby. Don't you want to be happy?
Happy had left the building hours ago. In its place stood a sinking feeling in Basil's gut, a sensation he usually drowned with another shot. But tonight, the feeling lingered. It whispered warnings about Trixie, a whirlwind of sequins and bad choices. She was trouble-wrapped in a leopard print dress. Basil knew this. He knew it in his bones, in the way his left eye twitched whenever Trixie smiled too wide. But tonight, logic was a distant cousin, not invited to this party. He downed his shot, the whiskey burning a trail down his throat. Basil Bagel Baker, all right, Trixie, let's do it. Trixie squealed, a high-pitched sound that shattered the quiet murmur of the bar. The Spangled Unicorn held its breath. Everyone knew Basil, everyone knew Trixie, and everyone knew this was going to end badly. The city was a living organism, pulsing with a rhythm all its own. It breathed differently at different hours, dictated by the ebb and flow of its inhabitants. The night owls, creatures of the dark, thrived in the neon-lit hours after midnight. They were the artists, the musicians, the dreamers who painted the town with their eccentricities. Then came the daybreakers, the early risers who fueled the city with their energy. They were the bakers, the builders, the ones who laid the foundation for the day's chaos. And somewhere in between, existing in the blurred lines of dawn and dusk, were people like Basil. The ones who didn't quite belong to either world, caught in the in-between. Basil had always been a night owl, drawn to the shadows and the solace they offered. But Trixie, she was a daybreaker, all sunshine and energy, a human alarm clock you couldn't snooze. And tonight their worlds were on a collision course.
You'll love it, Basil. Sunrise at the bagel factory is magical.
Basil highly doubted the magical properties of a flower-dusted sunrise. But Trixie, with her infectious optimism and complete disregard for common sense, had a way of making even the most absurd ideas sound almost plausible. The Bagel Factory. A place Basil avoided like the plague, a testament to his family legacy and his abject failure to live up to it. His great-great-grandfather, the infamous Barnaby Bagel Baker, had built an empire on dough and determination. An empire that had now dwindled to a single struggling factory. And thanks to Trixie's brilliant plan, Basil was now standing in the middle of it.
See? Magical.
Basil could see nothing magical about the stainless steel behemoths that churned out bagels with ruthless efficiency. He could, however, smell the faint aroma of burnt dough and despair, a scent that clung to him like a bad cologne. Basil Bagel Baker, Trixie, I don't think this is... Before he could finish his sentence, the factory floor erupted in a cacophony of clanging metal and panicked shouts. Lights flickered, machines sputtered, and in the center of it all stood Mr. Bigglesworth, the factory foreman, his face a mask of horrified fascination.
It's happening, the prophecy, the bagel singularity.
Basil wasn't sure what a bagel singularity was, but it didn't sound good. Not good at all. Little did Basil know he was about to witness the most extraordinary, the most absurdly lucrative 24 hours of his life. And it all started with a malfunctioning bagel-making machine and a healthy dose of blind luck. The bagel singularity, as it turned out, was not the end of the world. It was, however, the beginning of Basil's very strange, very short-lived journey to unimaginable wealth. The malfunctioning machine, instead of churning out ordinary bagels, started producing something extraordinary. Bagels infused with an inexplicable addictive quality. People couldn't get enough of them. These were not your average doughy breakfast staples. These bagels were life-changing. They made you feel invincible. They made you dance like nobody was watching. They made you call your estranged uncle and tell him you loved him. Overnight, Basil went from being the black sheep of the Bagel Baker family to the golden goose. The factory, once on the verge of bankruptcy, was now churning out millions. Basil was swimming in dough, and this time, it wasn't the baking kind. He bought a yacht he didn't know how to sail. He hired a personal chef who specialized in gold-flaked omelets. He even bought Trixie that diamond-encrusted tiara she'd always wanted, although by then, her affections had moved on to a Swiss chocolatier with a penchant for fondue fountains. But just as quickly as it began, it ended. The machine, with a final sputtering cough, returned to its old, reliable self. The magic was gone. The bagels were just bagels again. And Basil was left with nothing but a mountain of debt, a mild case of indigestion from all the gold flakes, and a lingering sense of what the hell just happened. Section 5. The sun also rises on Basil's misfortune. The first rays of dawn illuminated Basil's disheveled apartment. Empty champagne bottles littered the floor, a testament to his fleeting brush with the good life. He lay on the threadbare couch, a crumpled newspaper serving as a makeshift blanket. The headline mocked him: "Bagel boom goes bust. Bagel baker heir goes back to breadline." Basil groaned, his head pounded with a dull ache, a symphony of regret playing behind his eyes. He could still taste the phantom sweetness of success, the fleeting feeling of having it all. Now the only thing he had was a massive hangover and the sinking realization that he had to return the diamond-encrusted tiara. He stumbled to the window, squinting at the harsh morning light. The city was waking up, oblivious to his overnight roller coaster of fortune and misfortune. The daybreakers were already out, their chirpy greetings a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside Basil. Another day, another bagel, he muttered, forcing a humorless chuckle. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just another day. It was the day he had to face the consequences of his actions, the day he had to pick up the pieces of his shattered dream. And he had a sneaking suspicion it wouldn't involve diamond-encrusted anything. Section 6. A city that never sleeps, especially not Basil. The city was a relentless beast, a churning mass of humanity and ambition. It had a way of swallowing you whole if you let it, grinding you down until there was nothing left but dust and regret. Basil, however, had a knack for cheating the system. He was a survivor, a cockroach in a five-star restaurant, always finding a way to scrape by. He spent his days navigating the city's underbelly, a world teeming with hustlers, dreamers, and those who had fallen through the cracks. He knew the best places to score a cheap meal, the quietest corners to catch a nap, the friendliest faces who wouldn't judge him for the state of his life. Basil had always been a creature of habit, finding comfort in the familiar chaos of his routine. But after his brief, tumultuous affair with success, everything felt different. The city seemed louder, faster, its pulse quickening with a frenetic energy that mirrored his own racing thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was living on borrowed time, that the universe would soon come knocking to collect its due. It was a feeling that clung to him like a bad smell, a constant reminder of his fleeting brush with fortune and the inevitable fall from grace. Section 7. The fickle finger of fate and other appendages. Fate, Basil had learned, was a fickle mistress. One minute she's showering you with champagne and caviar, the next she's tripping you with a baguette and laughing at your misfortune. And in Basil's case, fate had a particularly twisted sense of humor. Just when he'd resigned himself to a life of quiet desperation, fate decided to throw him another curveball. This time it came in the form of a stray cat, a half-eaten tuna sandwich, and a very unfortunate incident involving Mr. Bigglesworth, the bagel factory foreman, and a vat of cream cheese. Basil had been minding his own business, enjoying the aforementioned tuna sandwich on a park bench when the stray cat decided to make its move. A chase ensued, a flurry of flailing limbs and indignant hisses, culminating in Basil tripping over his own feet and landing with a resounding thud right at the feet of Mr. Bigglesworth. Now Mr. Bigglesworth, still traumatized by the bagel singularity, had developed a nervous habit of carrying a vat of cream cheese wherever he went. It was his security blanket, his edible shield against the unpredictable nature of the universe. And as fate would have it, Basil's tumble sent the vat flying, its contents erupting in a glorious, gooey explosion that engulfed Mr. Bigglesworth from head to toe. Section 8. When life gives you lemons, make lemonade, then lose the recipe. Covered in cream cheese, Mr. Bigglesworth did not see the humor in the situation. He sputtered, he cursed, he threatened to sue Basil for every penny he didn't have. Basil, however, saw an opportunity, a crazy, ridiculous, possibly illegal opportunity. Basil, Mr. Bigglesworth, Basil began, his voice smooth as butter. What if I told you I could recreate the bagel singularity? Mr. Bigglesworth stared at him, his cream, cheese-covered face a mask of disbelief. Mr. Bigglesworth, you? But the machine, it's back to normal. It's impossible. Basil, impossible is my middle name, Basil lied. He didn't even know his middle name, but in that moment, fueled by a strange mix of desperation and the faint scent of cream cheese and opportunity, he knew he had to convince Mr. Bigglesworth. He spun a tale so outrageous, so utterly ridiculous, that even he was surprised when Mr. Bigglesworth bought it. He spoke of ancient bagel-making rituals, of secret ingredients passed down through generations, of cosmic alignments and the power of positive thinking. By the time he was finished, Mr. Bigglesworth was putty in his hands, eager to believe anything that promised a return to the glory days of the bagel singularity. And so Basil found himself back in the bagel factory, standing before the very machine that had brought him both incredible wealth and crushing defeat. This time, however, he had no idea what he was doing. Section 9. The more things change, the more they stay the same, except for Basil's bank account. Hope, like a stale bagel, has a short shelf life. Basil learned this the hard way as he stood before the bagel-making machine, surrounded by bags of flour, sugar, and Mr. Bigglesworth's increasingly frantic instructions. Mr. Bigglesworth, more cinnamon, Mr. Bigglesworth shrieked, his voice cracking with a mixture of anticipation and fear. The prophecy mentioned cinnamon. Basil, right cinnamon, Basil muttered, grabbing the nearest spice jar and dumping its contents into the machine. He had no idea what he was doing, but he figured a little extra spice couldn't hurt. Besides, he was pretty sure the spice jar actually contained paprika, not cinnamon. But in the heat of the moment, details seemed trivial. The machine whirred, coughed, and spat out a batch of bagels that looked suspiciously similar to the ones it had produced before Basil's grand arrival. Mr. Bigglesworth, his face falling faster than a poorly kneaded dough, snatched a bagel, took a bite, and let out a groan of disappointment. Mr. Bigglesworth. "It's no use," Mr. Bigglesworth lamented, his voice thick with despair. "The magic is gone. We're doomed." Basil, secretly relieved that his charade was over, patted Mr. Bigglesworth on the back with feigned sympathy. "Basil, there, Bigglesworth," he said, his voice dripping with false consolation. "At least we still have regular bagels and cream cheese. Don't forget the cream cheese." Section 10. One man's trash is another man's treasure, usually not Basil's, though. The sun, setting on Basil's second chance at bagel-related fortune, cast long shadows across the factory floor. Defeated but not entirely surprised, Basil bid farewell to a dejected Mr. Bigglesworth and stepped out into the cool evening air. He was drawn as if by some invisible force back to the park bench where his cream cheese-fueled adventure had begun. The stray cat, now looking suspiciously well-fed, sat perched on the back of the bench, its emerald eyes gleaming in the fading light. "Basil, don't suppose you have any more of that tuna sandwich, do you?" Basil asked the cat, his voice tinged with a mixture of amusement and resignation. The cat, in response, flicked its tail dismissively and sauntered away, leaving Basil to contemplate the absurdity of his life. As he sat there watching the last rays of sunlight fade from the sky, he noticed a crumpled piece of paper lying on the ground. He picked it up, smoothing it out to reveal a hand-drawn map, its edges frayed and stained with what looked suspiciously like cream cheese. Intrigued, Basil studied the map. It was a crudely drawn thing, but he could just make out the words Barnaby's secret stash scrawled across the top in faded ink. Barnaby, his great-great-grandfather, the bagel baron himself. A slow grin spread across Basil's face. Maybe, just maybe, fate wasn't done with him yet. After all, one man's trash is another man's treasure, even if that man's name is Basil Bagel Baker, and he has a knack for finding trouble wherever he goes. Section 11. Reflections on a night of highs and lows, mostly lows for Basil. The city lights twinkled, a million tiny stars reflecting in the inky blackness of the river. Basil, his silhouette a dark smudge against the cityscape, leaned against the railing of the bridge, the crumpled map clutched tightly in his hand. He'd been following the map's cryptic instructions for hours, his journey taking him through dark alleys, bustling marketplaces, and even a rather disconcerting puppet show. He still wasn't sure what he was looking for, but there was a glimmer of hope in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since the short-lived reign of the magical bagels. He thought about the events of the past 24 hours, the rapid ascent and even more rapid descent, the fleeting taste of fortune and the bitter aftertaste of failure. He'd lost everything, gained it back, and lost it again, all in the span of a single day. And yet, as he stood there, the cool night air against his face, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of peace. He was right back where he started, a little worse for wear, perhaps, but still standing. Basil took a deep breath, the scent of the city washing over him. It was a scent of possibility, of second chances, of dreams both realized and shattered. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't trade his crazy, unpredictable life for anything. Well, maybe for a lifetime supply of those magical bagels. But that was just a